What female historical figures get far too little credit and recognition? Isabella of France is known as the she-wolf of France, but people forget that she successfully invaded England and dethroned her husband, something the more famous Eleanor of Aquitaine failed to do. She was regent for several years and steadied the ship, though her peace treaties with Scotland and France were unpopular. It took the birth of her son, the true king, Edward III's son, and him to reach his majority to sort her out. Even though his wife interceded on behalf, and Isabella lived out the rest of her years peacefully. Honestly, we need more stories on the consorts of England that weren't Henry VIII's wives.
It's interesting how history often overlooks figures like Isabella of France. She did some serious stuff that gets overshadowed by the dramas of the more famous queens. It's a reminder that there are so many stories of powerful women throughout history who shaped nations, even if we don't hear much about them. More focus on these figures could really change our perspective on history.
Hildegard of Bingen is probably one of the most significant middle-aged scholars you've never heard of. She was a major educated woman, a nun in Germany in the 12th century who participated in a wide range of fields and is cited as one of the forebears of the revival of natural science in Germany. On the lower end, Marie de France was a contributor to Arthurian literature, including parts of Arthurian legend you've probably heard of but had no idea a woman first wrote about. Marie was a friend of Eleanor of Aquitaine as well. So for anyone interested in seeing our boy Richard in Fate/Strange Fake this year in anime, Marie de France is why Richard was such a fan of King Arthur. Marie helped refine the literature during her life and is responsible for popularizing Breton folk tales in French, which include tales of Arthur and his knights. Edit. Also a shout out to Matilda of Tuscany, who played an important political role in her life during feuds between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. She is one of the few women interned in St. Peter's Basilica.
It's interesting how history has these remarkable women that often get overlooked. Hildegard of Bingen was pretty ahead of her time, involved in so many fields. Then there's Marie de France, shaping Arthurian literature and connecting with figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine. And Matilda of Tuscany? She had a significant political role, which is impressive for her time. It just goes to show that women have always played vital roles, even if they don't always get the credit.
Sahara rose from being a slave and concubine kidnapped from Armenia in a very much Muslim medieval Egypt to a reigning queen, regent, and kingmaker in the emerging Mamluk Sultanate. She managed the country during the Mongol invasions and held the disintegrating remains of the collapsing Ayyubid Sultanate, founded by Saladin, together. Strong-willed and effective ruler. Seriously interesting figure, and fascinating how she was able to hold so much power semi-independently of men in an extremely patriarchal society. She even minted her own coins. She also has the distinction of being the first Mamluk Sultan, founding a state that would exist effectively in the same form as when she and Aybak ruled it, from her ascension in 1250 to the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517.
Shajar al-Durr's story is pretty wild. She went from being a slave to a queen in medieval Egypt, which is a big deal. Managing a country during the Mongol invasions isn't easy, especially as a woman in that time. It's impressive how she held power and even minted her own coins. Makes you think about the roles women can play, even in tough situations. Just a strong figure in history.
The Mercury 13 astronaut trainees. 13 women who all passed every test required to be astronauts. But due to sexism and the requirement for a military background, none of them were officially NASA astronauts. Although they all seemed to have achieved impressive careers after the program was shut down. Jerry Cobb in particular was arguably the most qualified anyone has ever been to be an astronaut, scoring in the top 2% on every single test. She also was instrumental in finding the other candidates. Cobb arrogantly deserved to become more famous than Neil Armstrong or Yuri Gagarin. Although Cobb was widely celebrated at the time, For both her contributions to science and humanitarian work, some of the others were less discussed, despite having impressive careers for decades afterwards. Only one of the 13, Wally Funk, was ever able to go to space, and Funk only as a passenger on a space tourism flight.
It's interesting how the Mercury 13 women trained hard and excelled, yet were overlooked because of outdated views. Jerry Cobb's achievements were remarkable, showing that qualifications matter more than the background. It's a shame that only Wally Funk got to experience space. Their stories really highlight how talent doesn't always get the recognition it deserves. It makes you think about how far we've come and the hurdles that still exist.
Frances Perkins, first woman to serve as a cabinet secretary as the Secretary of Labor under FDR. We have her to thank for Social Security, minimum wages and maximum hours, abolition of child labor, among other progressive labor standards. Without her, FDR's New Deal would have never happened. She also advocated for universal health insurance. A lot of the protections we continue to have as workers we have her to thank.
Frances Perkins really paved the way for a lot of labor rights. It's interesting to think about how one person's efforts can reshape policies that impact so many lives. Her role in the New Deal shows how critical leadership can drive major changes. She seems like someone who really understood the struggles workers faced and tried to make a difference. It's a reminder of the importance of activism and policy in shaping the future.
I recall hearing somewhere that Albert Einstein's first wife, Mileva Merrick, was about as involved in his early work as a physicist and mathematician as Marie Curie was with Pierre Curie's work on radiation and chemistry. The key reason that we know Marie Curie as well as we do is because her husband not only made sure they had equitable credit for their work, but he refused the Nobel when it was only offered to him and excluded his wife, forcing the committee to reconsider and include her as a recipient.
I didn't know that about Mileva Merrick. It's interesting how often women's contributions get overlooked in history. It's cool that Pierre Curie made sure Marie got recognition. That kind of support is important. Makes you think about how many stories like that exist, where one person's work is highlighted while another's just fades away. Recognition matters, not just in science, but in all kinds of fields.
Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first woman to go into space in 1963. She was a Soviet cosmonaut and even volunteered relatively recently to crew a one-way mission to Mars. Unfortunately, in later life, she's become a member of the Russian Duma and a bit of a puppet of Putin. But as a young woman, she slipped the surly bonds of Earth and set a precedent way before Sally Ride.
Valentina Tereshkova was a pioneer, going to space before many even thought it was possible for women. It's interesting how she shifted from an incredible achievement to a political role later in life. The contrast is kind of telling about how paths can change. Her early journey remains significant, but her later alignment with politics complicates her legacy a bit. Still, she broke barriers at a time when it mattered.
Personally, I'm a fan of Abigail Adams. Modern historians tend to lump her in with other American founders. Also, she was pretty funny. After the war, she and her husband were in England, and she wrote to Jefferson, "I fancy it must be the quantity of animal food eaten by the English which renders their character insusceptible of civilization."
Abigail Adams definitely had a unique perspective. Her humor shines through in that letter, showing she didn't hold back on her thoughts about the English. It's interesting to see how she blended her role as a founding figure with a personal touch. It makes her more relatable, giving a glimpse into her character beyond politics. It's cool how her words still resonate today. Overall, she was a pretty remarkable person.
Marie Curie gets recognition, sure, but almost always, she's credited as the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, which technically she is. However, she was the first person to win 2 Nobel Prizes and the only person to receive 2 Nobel Prizes in different scientific fields. She is the Nobel GOAT, not just a woman who won a Nobel Prize.
It's interesting how we often simplify complex achievements. Marie Curie's contributions go beyond just being the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. Her groundbreaking work in both physics and chemistry shows that she was a pioneer in science. People should recognize her for her actual impact rather than reducing her legacy to just being a woman in a male-dominated field. It's about the science, not just the gender.
Empress Dowager Cixi of Qing, China. She played a major part in the downfall of the Qing dynasty and held control for more than 50 years by installing her descendants as puppet emperors. When her nephew tried to reform the country, she tried to block his efforts and eventually led a coup against him.
Cixi's story is pretty interesting. She had a lot of power and influence for a long time. It's wild to think that she would undermine her own nephew's attempt to modernize things. Her control over the emperors shows how ruthless she was in maintaining power. It's a classic example of how personal ambitions can impact a whole dynasty. Ultimately, her actions contributed to the decline of the Qing dynasty.
Frances Oldham Kelsey. In 1960, she was one of 7 full-time physicians hired by the FDA to review drug applications. One of her first assignments was to review the application for thalidomide, a painkiller specifically marketed for pregnant women to relieve morning sickness. Although the drug already had approval in a dozen different European countries, and despite pressure placed on her, she stalled and delayed approval for over a year. It was eventually discovered that the company that developed thalidomide, Richardson Merrill, knew that it had caused birth defects in rats, but hid that information. Of course, the resulting birth defects in children were linked to the drug. Kelsey saved untold numbers of children in the U.S. from the horrors of thalidomide.
Frances Oldham Kelsey did something pretty remarkable. She was in a tough spot, working for the FDA and staring down a lot of pressure to approve thalidomide. But she held her ground and took her time. Turns out, her decision probably saved a lot of lives. It's wild how one person's determination can make such a huge difference. Kelsey really showed what standing up for safety looks like.
For real. Millions, no billions, of women who got up at or before dawn to haul water from the well, milk the cows, feed the chickens, tend the garden, feed everyone in the family every day, wash all the clothes by hand, mend the socks, stitch the clothes, brew the beer, churn the butter, try their best to make sure the children didn't die, work alongside others for the harvest, and or any crafts their family had going. Modern version, we've got a washing machine and don't have to hand sew our clothes, but there's still a hell of a lot of domestic labor that isn't really acknowledged as real work. The mundane stuff might not be glamorous, but without it, none of the great things would be possible. Someone's got to make sure there are clean socks and dinner, or it would all fall apart in a matter of days. There's also plenty of men who do the mundane shit that keeps the world running too.
It's a solid point. The everyday tasks often get overlooked. My mom used to wake up early to make sure everything was ready before we started our day. It was all the little things that kept the household running smoothly. Even now, I see friends juggling jobs and chores, so much goes unseen. That foundational work is key, but it doesn't always get the credit it deserves.
Her opinion was respected not because John Adams loved her, but because she was intelligent and witty and held strong political opinions. Harry Truman famously said Abigail Adams would have made a better president than John Adams. Adams could have hated her, but that wouldn't change anything about her own competencies.
It's interesting how respect can come from intelligence rather than just love. Abigail Adams had a strong voice and was influential in her own right. It's kind of funny how people often overlook that a partner can have skills that outshine their spouse. Harry Truman's comment just reinforces that idea. Sometimes the best people are the ones standing beside you, pushing you to be better in their own way.
There were ostensibly some women rules who maintained, during their own rule, a non-feminine title. The main one I know of is Wu Zetian used the same titles a male emperor would have used during the height of her power. It was after her rule ended that her titles were altered to be those of a woman, which is to say that when she could get away with it, she styled herself emperor, not empress.
That's an interesting take on gender roles in history. Wu Zetian really pushed the boundaries of what was expected at the time. By using the title of emperor, she showed that power wasn't just a male domain. After her reign, it seems like society felt the need to go back to traditional titles. It's fascinating how titles and roles can reflect deeper cultural attitudes.
A bachelor is something you are or not. I would point out King of X or why Emperor of Z are titles, and titles are something you claim. They could be used descriptively, as well, like the title of bachelor. A title is not always descriptive. It helps in Zetian's case that the specific, in Chinese, titles she claimed weren't linguistically masculine, though we translate them to emperor or empress in English. That's for the convenience of us English speakers/readers. The Chinese title of Huangdi does not denote that the holder is a man. It's just that women basically never held the title except for Wu Zetian and some other lady later who kind of did a similar thing, who afforded themselves the title and had such power in the court that at least for a time no one offended could contest them. Another example are the classical Maya, who only had one word for a city's ruler. On the happenstance, a woman was the city's ruler. That was also her title. We currently translate that title to either lord or king.
This story makes me think about how titles can shape perception. Like, in different cultures, the same title can mean something entirely different. It's interesting how history shows that power isn't always linked to gender. Wu Zetian really broke the mold, claiming her title despite the norms. It's a reminder that context matters when we talk about roles and identity. Titles can be just words until someone's actions give them weight.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.